all, happy Friday. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk today, as you see, about voting. And we're gonna talk about it in a few different ways, but I think that there's been an increased interest in who's voting, how we're voting, making sure that people are getting out to vote, and at the same time, right, I kind of hear these ongoing conversations about whether or not voting matters, what is its actual utility, what do we do when we don't like any of the candidates running. So hoping that we get to tackle a little bit of that today. And if you're just coming in, or even if you're already seated, please feel free to move up closer. I'd love if folks want to participate. I really want to hear your thoughts about some of these questions, whether or not you vote and why, and what you see as the purpose of it. And hopefully we get to dialogue about that a little bit. But I'm just going to start with actually introducing Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago a little bit, and my own background. And thank you, Ross, for that great introduction and having me here today. So like you heard, I work for this organization called Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. And this is our mission statement. So Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago builds power through collective advocacy and organizing to achieve racial equity. So this is something that we, really intentionally have been thinking about, that as an Asian American org, what is our role in the broader policies that are being created in our city and state? How can we make sure that we're thinking about things holistically, advocating for the needs of our community, but really being in line with other folks facing barriers in Chicago and Illinois, other communities of color, and especially other immigrant communities in fighting for a better state. So a lot of what we do is working with community members like youth, second-gen folks, elders, people that live in both Chicago and the suburbs. We advocate for different policies, both at the city and state level, around making sure that immigrants are safe, have access to resources, and are able to live healthy and full lives. So we have a few different programs that we do this through. One is called Kinetic, and this is our youth program. So Kinetic works actually in Chicago Public Schools, and so they have a curriculum portion where students get to learn about racial inequity, the root causes of this, how civic engagement works, how city and state government is set up, and then they're also able to get involved in after-school activities like work on different policy campaigns to improve things in their schools or across the Chicago public school system, CPS. And this is a photo from our annual youth art gallery that we do. So again, featuring art from immigrant and refugee students. I think this particular gallery last year, sorry the photo's dark, but had art from folks as young as second grade through our high schoolers, and is a great opportunity for the youth to talk about their experiences and what it's like to move to a new country and go to school in a new place, and the barriers you face when you might not speak the language. If any of you are from the Chicago area, our gallery event is actually coming up a week from today on Friday, and so if you're interested in joining, we'd love to have you. You can ask me more about it. Then we have a Just Shy. So this is a grassroots community group that's really open to anyone that's interested in getting involved. It tends to attract a lot of folks that live in the Chicago area that are second or third generation Asian American, and really thinking about their own experiences growing up, as people of color in Chicago or in the U.S., and the experiences of their families as immigrants. So they're split up into different working groups around issues that they want to work on, and the group makes decisions collectively about kind of what their priorities are. So right now they have one group that focuses on immigration work, so they're doing some work around city level policy, but they also do know your rights trainings. So they go to different organizations or schools and give trainings on what to do if ICE comes to your door, how to react in those situations, training folks as bystanders, how you can support your neighbors if you see immigration authorities. They also have a police accountability group that does similar work. They're currently involved with a campaign to end the gang database in Chicago, which is a way of criminalizing folks that can also be used in deportation proceedings, and they're also in the process of kind of developing similar know your rights trainings around interacting with law enforcement and bystander trainings. So outside of meetings, they also host just like more informal events, potlucks, and et cetera, to kind of create that sense of community around all of the work. And then we also have the PanAsian Voter Empowerment Coalition. So this is a group we bring together of 13 different Asian American orgs. A lot of them are based in particular ethnic communities and offer services like legal clinics, youth programs, senior programs, employment support. And this crew actually came together around the 2010 census and has been a place for us to develop a shared policy agenda, advocate for that collectively at the state level, and then also run a coordinated civic engagement program like across different ethnic groups in Chicago and the suburbs. So I want to get into the voting piece a little bit. So in my current role, I run the Civic Engagement Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and we're a C3 nonpartisan group, which means that we just call people and talk to them about issues, talk to them about why it's important to vote, but we don't tell them who to vote for. In my previous roles, I've worked as an organizer on political campaigns, like working for a specific candidate. I've also done voter engagement efforts through working as a labor organizer, so getting union members involved with supporting union-endorsed candidates, and altogether have worked on 8 election cycles, like in different capacities, and so just have a lot of feelings about what it even means to work within the system of voting. And I think to really cover that, we have to think about where the system of voting comes from and how it has evolved, and really the history of voter disenfranchisement in the United States. I think this is a very small snapshot, and this could be, frankly, it's a class on its own, but one of the things we see as kind of like a grandfather law is this law in Massachusetts in 1857 that was intentionally targeted to make it harder for immigrants to vote. And so it was if you've heard of those voting laws around literacy tests, but in this case, if your grandfather voted, you didn't need to take a literacy test to determine your voter eligibility. But if you didn't have a grandfather that had voted, then you did need to take a literacy test and pass it to be able to vote. So really was just weeding out more recent arrivals to the country. And this law kind of became the predecessor to a whole slew of intentionally racist voting laws in the Jim Crow South, where we see things like poll taxes, again, literacy tests, just widespread, really focused at making sure that Black Americans were not able to vote. In the early 20th century, we see the rise of the women's suffrage movement, culminating in the passage of an amendment that allows specifically white women to vote, because at this point, no people of color can really easily access the ballot box in the US anyway. And a lot of racism is in that movement as well, right? Like exclusion of women of color that wanted to be a part of that effort. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 pushes back against this. It's won through decades of organizing, most famously the Selma March, really pushing for this, and extends the right to vote, and now allowing people of color to actually access the ballot. And it's something we're still dealing with. I think the most recent example people point to is Georgia last year, creating a new voter ID law and then closing DMVs in predominantly Black counties, which means that you now need an ID to vote, but it's extremely difficult to get an ID. In 2014, I worked on a campaign in Texas and learned a little bit about how the voter registration program works there. And you actually have to go to this training and become deputized as a voter registrar to register somebody else to vote. If you want to do that, you have to get deputized in every county that you want to register voters. If after that you may ever make any mistakes in filling out the form, or you register someone who lives in a county that you're not deputized in, you could be fined. You could actually face jail time for that offense. I don't think it's very common that people actually do face those consequences, but that's the law that we're still working under, like current day. And I don't think that Illinois is an exception either. Like, from having worked many elections in Chicago, and in my current work, we run like a voter protection program specifically to make sure that folks have access to in-language materials that are legally mandated at voting sites. And every single election, it's shocking how many places open late, don't have the right amount of judges, don't have the materials that they're supposed to have, don't have the correct signs posted. And it's just a continual problem that creates these barriers for folks to vote. So in just thinking about the importance of voting and being someone that advocates for folks to actually go out and vote and how that can be transformative, I also think a lot about the limitations of that and who's actually empowered by that and what we can win through the ballot box and not. Sorry. So here is what voting actually looks like currently and who votes in the US. And this is compared to other countries, and it's taking data from a range of 2014 through 2016. And you kind of see us down at the bottom. And it's 55.7% turnout in the United States in 2016. And again, that's a presidential year, so that's pretty much the highest that we see, especially when you compare it to midterm elections or local elections. And on this chart, we have Belgium in 2014 at 87.2% voter turnout. So there is some work to do. This breaks it down a little bit more demographically. Again, I don't know how legible these are from the back, but on this side, we have voter turnout in presidential elections, 2000 to 2016, broken down by race. So you kind of see the racial disparities. And then similarly by age. So apparently millennials were the only age group to see voter turnout increase since 2012, but we're still way down here at the bottom compared to, this is 30 to 40, 45 to 64, and 65 plus. So who's voting in the United States also disproportionately skews older and whiter, and isn't always representative of our entire population. So I'm curious, maybe by a show of hands, how many folks would say that voting is important and that your vote matters? How many disagree? Well, I guess that makes sense for this talk. So this chart is all of the presidents that have won the presidency even after losing the popular vote in the US, and the margin by which they lost the popular vote in thousands. So I actually, I do think voting is important and I do think folks should vote, but I understand that there's some valid arguments about why folks think that their vote doesn't matter. And especially when it comes to presidential elections, I actually don't think that a single vote makes a difference, because that's just not what the data shows us. We've never had that kind of a margin in a presidential election. In fact, we see the opposite sometimes, where actually twice in recent history we've seen somebody lose the popular vote but still win the presidency. And of course, that's because of the Electoral College. But I see the two-party system as another barrier. We have candidates that are, chosen by parties that don't have to go through democratic processes. They, can actually run however they want to select who their nominee is. things like superdelegates that folks argue are undemocratic, but parties aren't regulated the same way as elections are. They're private entities, but because we have such a strong two-party system, like even when it comes to who our options are in the general election, they don't always reflect who folks wanted to see on the ballot. And then, voting alone is kind of a small piece of things. Like you're voting for, in Illinois, one state rep out of 118. Nationally, you're voting for one congressperson out of 435. Like, that has an impact, but by itself doesn't really usually change any laws or any realities of what we're living with. And then, if we just voted for candidates based on the platform that they ran on, do we think that folks always deliver on their promises? I heard some laughs and some nods no. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember in 2012, this organization I was volunteering with, we were doing a lot of work to get this one person elected to Congress because she had promised us that she would support this particular tax plan. And, a lot of folks driving out on their weekends to canvass in Chicago in February, not really fun work all the time. And she won, she got elected, goes to Washington, and a few months later when we follow up and say, have you signed on to this bill that we had talked about, she changed her mind. And, unfortunately, I think that happens a lot. So since most people raise their hand around they do think voting matters, like, would a few folks be willing to share why you think it does, or why you personally vote?
I can talk loud. Hello. Michael Moore, who is the filmmaker, was on Chris Hayes' show and pointed out that the number of people who did not vote for president in the last election, the 2016 election, but yet voted down ballot. And if you look at those down ballot votes, if they had voted for president, then Hillary Clinton would have won Michigan. I personally ran for city council in a little town, and I lost by 140 votes in an election where 520 people did not vote who were registered. Not saying I would have won, but.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that is one thing I would argue strongly as well, that local races actually are hugely impactful, right? Like a lot of the things that we're living with day to day, whether it's how your garbage is collected, how well your street is maintained, your local school, that's decided by your city council people, your state reps, your state senators. The first state representative I ever worked for lost his first election by 125 votes. I've seen state rep races literally be decided by a single vote, or when they tie and you have to pull a name out of a hat. So those margins can be really, really small. Someone else on why you take time out of your day to vote?
I think that voting in itself is kind of encourages an investment into kind of educating yourself about different political candidates and your options, and make sure that you keep up to date so that you don't just go to the polls and vote randomly, like blue or red, I guess.
You had your hand up, right?
So I don't personally vote just because I'm not from here, so we don't have a democracy back home. It's a monarchy, but I think that it's super important to vote as a younger person, just because, like you showed the graphs, the youngest people are the only ones seeing a rise in voting, but they're not nearly as much as people who kind of make the deciding votes, I guess. And if you look at it like in a cheesy way, like you're the people of the future, you're going to be dealing with the repercussions of whoever is in power. So I really think it's important for young people.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree completely, like especially about what you said. I don't think it's cheesy. We do have to deal with the decisions that are being made right now, and I think that's so well highlighted, right, by like younger climate activists, that we're not always at those tables making decisions that are going to severely impact the rest of our lives. So absolutely, like, first of all, I think everything is at stake, right? The people that we elect into office get to make decisions about our housing, our taxes, our climate, education, healthcare, transportation, like so many different aspects of our lives that we don't always even think about as political, but they are being shaped by policy at every level. And then, you know, what you brought up about not voting certainly has an impact, right, when folks choose to sit elections out. And back to the other point about we know who's consistently voting, and so when we choose to opt out of the process, like we know how decisions are being made, and to think about what that means for our futures. I also think that there's a good argument I've heard a lot of activists make around harm reduction. Even if you feel like you don't like either of the candidates or any of the candidates that are up for a certain, you know, race, how much does it matter to choose whoever you see as the lesser of two evils, and what does that mean the impact will be on your community, and making that calculation. And then what you had brought up is, I would say, yeah, it's a great entry point. Like sometimes that's the first time we start kind of thinking about policies and what they mean, and hearing folks like present different arguments, especially in presidential campaigns. Like, I know that's been true for me. Like, I definitely was someone in high school that would have said politics is stupid. It's just like a bunch of people in suits arguing about things in Washington. And it took me a while to kind of make those connections about how those arguments actually impact my life, and understanding those, and like seeing presidential debates was part of that. So what do you think like makes people more likely to vote? Like how, there's so many people in the world that run different voter engagement campaigns or try to reach out to voters. I'm curious like what folks think the impact of those is, and like we know that some people are consistently being left out of it, and like why? Like what makes someone more likely to vote? Make it easier? Yeah.
What I said earlier, make sure that it's important that people understand how important it is.
Yeah.
First level of being active in democracy.
Yeah. In back. Do you want a mic? Yeah, if there's a candidate you feel passionate about. Back table? Yeah, okay, so she said understanding the consequences of what happens if you don't vote. Was there another hand?
I think if your friends and family and people you're surrounded by are voting and tested and keeping up with elections, that you're probably more likely to vote as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, being part of the community. Feeling that you're connected with like-minded people and using that as a jumping off.
Accessibility, just in terms of physical accessibility, like are you able to physically go to
Yeah.
place where the ballots are, and also is the ballot in a language that you can understand and effectively say, like, I agree with this cause, or I agree with this person.
Yeah, absolutely. So accessibility, both physical accessibility and language accessibility, and then being part of community, especially when, you know, folks around you are talking about voting and encouraging that. So I just want to, talk on kind of like the different ways that people put together these voter outreach plans. So, one of the most prominent is when you have somebody running for office and they're out there campaigning and talking to folks about why it's important to vote. And this isn't the case all the time, but often when you're running a campaign like that, resources are tight, right? You have a clear deadline of election day, and it's pretty clear you either win or lose. There isn't a lot of gray area. You want to win. You're constantly fundraising, right? Like all of those different things that make it harder to build out programs are in short supply. And a lot of candidates, therefore, are targeting folks that are consistent voters. So, a lot of us use a database of who in your state or who in your district is registered to vote, and from it you can pull out a list of everyone who's voted in at least, let's say 2 out of the 4 previous elections, and that's who you're going to talk to about candidate so-and-so to make sure that they get out and vote, and you're going to explain to them why this person is the best person to vote. And when those people are being talked to, that makes them more likely to vote because they're hearing directly from a campaign, they're being persuaded, they're being reminded again and again that there's an election. And so if they all go out and vote, now they're, again, when you look at how often they vote, that score continues to go up and candidates keep talking to them. And it can create this cycle where people who registered to vote and maybe only ever voted once in their lives or have never voted are not talked to by a campaign, so they don't go vote, so then they're not talked to by the next campaign and are just kind of consistently left out of what we call that target universe. And so where I work, since we're a nonpartisan group and we're not campaigning for a particular candidate, our goal is to actually target those folks that maybe have voted once in the last 6 elections or are registered to vote but have never voted, and reach out to them and at least provide a reminder that here are some of the issues at stake in this election, here's when the election is, here's how you can go vote, to try to help them become more regular voters. And some candidates do a good job thinking about that. And, when they say we're trying to expand the electorate, we're trying to bring in new folks, or when they're registering new voters and making sure to follow up with them. But I do find that there's just this pattern of people become regular voters, or folks feel like they kind of just get left out of the system. And it's not always obvious that there's an election coming up. I didn't vote in the first election I was eligible for because it was a midterm election, and honestly, it just never occurred to me. I was in college at the time. I maybe heard something about it, but it's just not something I was thinking about. There was no one running for president. None of my friends were really talking about it. It was just totally not on my radar. And so that's really one of the things that we work on, is trying to break down that barrier and at least make sure that it's something people are aware of, they know the date, and we can encourage them to help make a plan to follow through on to actually get out and vote. Oh, sorry, this photo is some of our volunteers actually doing some poll watching. Again, so we'll go to different polling sites and make sure that they're especially compliant with having in-language materials in areas where you have high concentration of immigrant populations, so that folks at least have some language accessibility to vote. And of course, this only, even in Chicago, covers 4 languages. So it's not comprehensive, and it's not available at every polling site. They kind of determine where you have a majority of folks that speak a certain language and then try to meet that need. But this is something that we're also working on, is expanding the amount of languages available and the availability of these materials, and have also seen some recent success in Cook County, where they've added 2 new languages for this year and are bringing on, I think, 4 new languages next year to, again, provide more resources for folks to be able to access the polls. So a little bit on how our program actually runs and what the impact of it is. And this is actually a photo of me and my parents phone banking, or calling folks, asking them to come vote. I roped them into the effort. And they were honestly excellent phone bankers. Like, thinking back to points folks made about the importance of being in a community or having friends and family that vote. Like, we think a lot about and talk a lot about language and try to have volunteers that can speak different languages to folks that aren't native English speakers, right, or might have limited English proficiency. But I find that, like, especially as someone who's second generation, like, I speak Hindi fairly well, but I've never really had to talk about voting. Like, some of that vocab just feels really unfamiliar. Like, it's not my tendency to pick up the phone and just, like, switch into a language unless I know that somebody can't speak English. Like, right, I would always prefer English. And I noticed my dad doing this thing when he started phone banking is whenever he saw a name on the list that he was like, this person probably speaks Hindi or Urdu, he would just start the conversation in Hindi, and people talked to him for longer. Like, people were more responsive to him, more people committed to him that they were going to vote, and then they did to me, and I was like, this actually, it makes a lot of sense. Like, meeting people where they're at and thinking about language accessibility not only as this person can't speak English, but this person feels comfortable in this language. Like, they were able to kind of immediately build this connection and trust that just made him super successful. So we'll see if they come back, but we had a good time. So I wanted to share some numbers with you, and these are from our civic engagement work in 2018. So these numbers are for the whole state of Illinois. So across Illinois, in the primary, we see 25.8% of folks turning out to vote, of registered voters. In the Asian American Pacific Islander community, you have 13.7% of registered voters coming out to vote. But for the folks that we contacted, whether we talked to them on the phone or on the doors, that rate goes up to 27.5% for just Asian Americans that we talked to. So just having even those like one or two conversations is able to boost turnout quite a bit and kind of like start closing this gap that we see, especially with minority groups. And the results were very similar in our work in the midterm. So in November, again, turnout across Illinois is 54.8%. In AAPI communities, it's 43.9%, but for the group of folks that we talk to, it's 55.7%. So I think it tracks in kind of closing that gap and actually making a difference in how likely folks are to vote. So of the people that we actually had conversations with, they were 30% more likely to vote than folks we did not talk to. And these are not, even extremely long conversations. Most of these are conversations with a stranger on a phone. You can't, you're not even looking at them face to face. And I don't have numbers to share on this, but that to me says that if you're having these conversations, if you're talking to your friends or your family, or we're able to do even more door knocking and have face-to-face conversations, we could be making even more of an impact. And that even those like 4 or 5 minutes actually matter a lot. Because when you see, these numbers multiplied by, 12 million people in Illinois, like those margins decide races all the time. Like, that's huge. So also come phone bank with us, please. I know we're kind of far from here, but we can work something out. To kind of bring it back to this question of does voting matter, I would say a little bit, or kind of like yes and. I think voting is actually a relatively easy thing you can do to voice how you feel about something, to have an impact on an issue that you care about. But there's so many other pieces of the puzzle. There's so many things to do like before it actually comes to election day and also afterwards. So, right, like one thing is you could go vote. Also, if you did one phone bank shift and you talked to 5 voters and now 2 of them are voting who weren't before, like you've tripled your impact. You know, same thing if you go canvassing, if you're talking to family and friends. And the other thing is, like, most of the time people vote on issues, and that's why they vote, right? We vote because we want better health care. We vote because we want to make sure that immigrant communities are safe, or whatever issue it is that moves you or that you're thinking about when you're even choosing which candidates to vote for. And what we try to do in our work is like engage people around those issues. So all of those conversations that we were having back in November, when we called people, we weren't saying, hey, there's an election, go vote. We were saying, hey, have you heard that family-based immigration is actually under attack? And folks in Washington are talking about eliminating the pathways that allow your siblings or parents to, you know, come to this country and join you, right? It's like a family reunification issue. And getting folks to engage with that, sharing stories of our own families, asking them about what their experience has been, and then saying, hey, it sounds like you really care about this. Like, this is something that's at stake in this election. Like, can we count on you to go vote and to look at candidates that are fighting for this issue and fighting to protect our communities? And a lot of folks did engage with us on that and told us stories about their sibling that they haven't seen in years, or, you know, a family member that was able to come and now they're so grateful to have like a parent nearby, or have, you know, be reunited with a child. But around all of this, it's doing that education, like helping to understand not only the issues, but how to go vote, like all of the different offices that might be on a ballot. We do some of like the trainings and workshops that I talked about earlier with our youth group and our Just Shy group. We run issue-based campaigns, right? Like on that issue of family-based immigration, we've been a part of a nationwide effort called Value Our Families for folks to better understand like that particular issue. And regardless of who's in office, we're calling them and saying, hey, this is important to us. Like, will you support this bill to make sure that our families can stay together? We've held candidate forums. So recently in February, we had the Chicago like municipal elections going on, and we held a mayoral forum where we had a few of the candidates running for mayor come and, you know, specifically talk to Asian Americans across the city about issues that we cared about. Like, we got to ask them questions and hear their stances on things. We might work on ballot referendums, which is another way to, right, kind of fight for an issue. Some of these might be binding, some of them might be more of a recommendation, but it's a way of also voicing our opinion in a collective voice that isn't necessarily about a candidate. We can run campaigns that like target companies or corporations. Recently, there was a Marriott hotel in Chicago that held a conference of Customs and Border Patrol agents that are involved in family separations. So we, you know, protested it, held an action against them, you know, talked to media about it. We have our election protection work to make sure that when the polls are open, that they're in compliance with state and local law, and actually providing opportunities for folks to be able to go participate and cast their vote. And then there's so many local organizations that are doing this kind of work or providing essential services, providing like ESL education, like civics education, citizenship support, voter registration, to like bring folks in and educate them about like every part of being involved in civic life and democracy. And hopefully all of these things, right, are using voting as a small piece. Like, I see it as like one tactic or one way that we kind of win these larger things, but keeping our focus on who we're fighting for, on who our community is, and what the things are that we need. So, thank you. Do you have a question? Okay.
Test. Yeah. I spoke to you before, and it's voter suppression that I'm really concerned about, Stacey Abrams' work. You had a line up there, Jim Crow. What we have now is the new Jim Crow. I really respect these people that wait 6 and 7 hours in lesser funded communities. Just editorialize a moment. I wanted to react on that, but the real reason I think the Republicans won't pass more money for voting, and it's not so much the Russian influence, it's the fact that it would cramp their style at voter suppression. We would have better machines for all the communities, equal access to the vote, and no purges and all the shenanigans that are going on. And on the Facebook page for this event, I posted a couple of videos, links to videos that are on this issue. Greg Palast and Robert Greenwald of Brave New Films. So, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should definitely be paying attention to what's happening with any voter suppression effort across the country. And, you know, kind of thinking back to that chart of American voter turnout, like comparison to other countries, like, why is that? Why is it so hard to register to vote here or access the polls? And I think there's so many different barriers we can break down in that realm.
So I worked at the past election, and I just like found it interesting how a lot of the people like that were told in like their sheet of paper, like the location where they were like to vote, that like there was just so many miscommunication in like the district I was working that like they had to like, we had to tell them like this wasn't where they were registered to vote. So like that, they came in like very limited like schedules because people have to work. So they were coming very early just to like, this isn't like the place, and like this isn't where you're supposed to be, like, and stuff. So I guess like those inconveniences like don't make that much sense, because like it's like, why is like the information not being like communicated correctly? So I thought it was like, yeah.
Well, do you have any guesses? Like, why do you think that is?
Honestly, like, I think it's lack, so we're the community that I'm from is predominantly Latino, so I was like maybe thinking about this, like, but I don't know. But it was like, it was also like, yeah, it was like it was in like the Cook County and stuff, so I mean, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you know, definitely I think we do see patterns of like voter disenfranchisement that is clearly racist. And a lot of it is just lack of investment broadly. And, you know, sometimes that is like disparate between communities, but it's also like why maybe we should need to be fighting for more like state resources for voting. Like that's something that we need to invest in more heavily. And to your point about limited time, like that's a huge barrier that keeps people from voting, is just having the time to go do so. And I know there's people advocating for things like Election Day being a national holiday or paid time off to vote. So I've heard different like solutions to that as well.
I think a lot of these problems can be solved if students would register and vote. The data show that on this campus only about 13% of students are registered. At Northwestern, it's more like 90%. The way they did that was that during the what do I want to say? The new students arriving orientation program, they had a dimension of that orientation as new freshmen came in. Everybody, you know, toward the end of that orientation needed to then register and then also vote. And within 4 years, they got it from 13% up to 90%. Well, we have now the chancellor here who has signed on to trying to get this happen here, and has hired somebody and has got this person over in the Student Affairs Office. This Y is joining with other organizations to try to foster this, including WILL, to promote it. And so it's when students don't vote that they get these bad problems. We used to have Dennis Bing here, and he didn't, he set up registrations that made it, you know, very, very inaccessible. And then this last time around, more students got out and got upset with the current, the past county clerk, who was running for the county exec, and they threw him out and got a new county clerk, and now there's going to be many, many more access to voting stations, including one here at the Y, around the campus. So it's not demonstrating, it's a matter of voting. We've got a Representative Rodney Davis who's got a record of 0% support for doing something about climate change. Why does he keep getting reelected here? It's because the students don't vote.
So I would agree that, I think if young people across the board voted, it would be transformative. I also just want to caution against blaming students for not voting. I think there's a lot of different reasons that happens, but I will plug that Illinois has same-day voter registration, so even if you forget to register on election day, you can go to your polling place, register, and vote right then and there. And we're also working on implementing automatic voter registration in Illinois, and hopefully these things do make it easier. But if you're part of a student group, this is definitely something you can be working on. And again, just even reminding people on election day can make a huge difference.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. I wanted to ask, since you noted that you worked with nonpartisan groups, and I'm wondering if you ever came across any experiences with voters secrecy or afraid to disclose the party affiliation or who they're voting for because of the party affiliation or anything like that. If you could speak to maybe some of your experience, if you have any on that, and how that affects some of all of this, going on public with campaigns and everything.
So yeah, I would say as in the nonpartisan efforts, that doesn't come up, but when I have worked for particular candidates, a lot of times folks will say that's private, or I don't want to tell you, or I don't need to share with you who I'm voting for, which I think is their right, and it is private who you're specifically voting for. I don't know if that answers your question. If I think so, yeah. I'm not sure I have a good answer, though. No, that's okay. Yeah, I think it varies. Some people do feel very protective about that, and I think as folks feel that the political climate is more polarized, sometimes there's more resistance to having those conversations. But I think that my hope is that we are always leading with issues and focusing on that, and that's leading to better conversations than talking about candidates, and maybe that will help break some of that down. But yeah, I think that is a broad challenge. Yeah, thank you. Sorry if those. Is there a hand up? Okay, I'm coming.
I just wanted to thank you for taking time out of your day to come and speak to us. But I think my question is, how do we not become disillusioned with the voting process? As someone who has participated, but I also understand that the very system in which we are participating was not created for us to have life. The fact that we are looking for the thing that is oppressing us to also empower us is a difficult notion to swallow. Right, like the Audre Lorde quote, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so I think what for you has been maybe a hopeful or uplifting or encouraging way in looking at how can we both hold abolition and restructuring or radical reimagining of the world that we live in addition to still having to sit with the here and now, the painful, very broken processes that we are left with.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's difficult all the time, not just with voting, but a lot of it, right? Even working on trying to pass laws through different bodies of elected officials. I don't think that we have the luxury of not participating in these systems, though, because not participating certainly isn't getting us anything. I believe like very strongly in just using a diversity of tactics and having a diversity of organizations, like, you know, working on issues in all different ways, like both, like you can have direct actions that are transformative and that are, you know, can be very grassroots, like might not be folks that really want to engage with the process of like voting. And then you might have like other folks that really feel similarly about an issue but are actually trying to pass a bill through their state legislature that I think are all kind of like meeting a similar goal in different ways, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that like voting inherently is transformative, but I think it is a tool that can help us make huge strides, like in particular ways, and just to not ever see it as like the one and only thing that we do, and just like a small piece in a larger framework. And I think we have to continue to contend with like the world as it is now and do our best within that, even while like having a radical imagination and framework for like what's the transformation that you're working on. So if that helps. I think it's hard. I think it's good to keep wrestling with, though, because it helps kind of keep you accountable to what you like more deeply care about. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that was a great one to end on. Thanks, y'all.